All right, well, good morning. We're in another class in the book of Matthew. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 7, if you want to go ahead and get your Bibles over there. And we're going to be hitting on a few different topics. So if I'm blazing through this, just feel free to stop me and we can talk about it. But we're going to talk about a few different elements in chapter 7 today. We got our slides ready to go. While they're working on that. So we live in a world where you probably hear this phrase quite a bit. You can't judge me, or you shouldn't judge me. How many people in here like to be judged? No, we don't. But we live in a world that's full of judgments and people judging, people not wanting to be judged. So what does Jesus have to say about the topic on being judged? I want to start this morning with a little bit of a thought exercise, if you'll bear with me for a minute. And imagine that you are in a courtroom scenario, and you're the accused. And for the sake of argument, let's just say, and I'll let you fill in the blank on what you did. Okay, I don't want to be presumptuous, but think about what it is you could have done. But let's just say the evidence is overwhelming. You did it. There's really no getting around it. The evidence is there. It's overly clear. And you show up to court that day, and there's a whole courtroom full of people ready to get their sentences for whatever they did. And you're the first person. And you show up there, you're standing before the judge, and he walks up there, he's got his big flowing robe on, he gets to sit down in his big comfy chair, and he looks at you and he says, well, it seems pretty clear that you're guilty. And the law says that your punishment should be XYZ, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, life. But he says, today I want to do something a little bit different. Instead of just doing what the law says, do something a little bit unique. I'm going to go sit down in the back of the courtroom. I'm just going to sit down, and I'm going to let you come sit up in my big comfy chair. And I'm going to let you be the judge for the day. I'm going to let you assess the judgment of all these people in here. And at the end of the day, you're going to come back to where you're standing now. I'm going to go sit back in my big comfy chair. And I'm going to use the exact same standard that you used for all these other people, and I'm going to apply that to your judgment. How would you respond to that? Sounds like a pretty good opportunity, right? Clearly, I did whatever I did. I'm guilty of it. The sentence is set in stone. But hey, there's an opportunity for me to show some leniency on people. Maybe I can be kind. I can be merciful. Maybe that could help my position out a little bit. How would you handle that? What would you do with that? Seems pretty reasonable that you would try to, assess your judgments in a way that you would want to be judged at the end of the day. But then you sit down in that big comfy chair and, ooh, it's comfy. Feels pretty nice. Feels powerful. That gavel's sitting right there. Man, I really want to pick that thing up and bang it on the table. How would you use this power? How would you use this opportunity? So Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So that's kind of interesting. For in the same way you judge others, you too will be judged. It's almost as if there's some say or some influence we can have, potentially, on how we are going to be judged. Well, let's talk about this for a minute. What does it mean to be judged, and why do we do it? Those are two very distinct questions. What does it mean to judge, and why do we do it? So we live in a world full of values. And I'm not necessarily talking right now about like moral values. I'm talking about everything in this world has a value. People, places, things, objects, things that you like to do. Everything can be assigned some type of value. And we weigh those values every single day without you even thinking about it. You're constantly weighing the value of different things. And there are numerous different ways and methods that we use to weigh out those values. And we're constantly, again, making those value determinations. So for a little bit of an example, I said every object has a value. Let's talk about this pen for a minute. This pen has a value. And it has different kinds of value. So on one hand, you have what I'm going to call actual values, right? It's made up of certain materials. Each one of those materials has its own distinct value. You put it all together, it has a different kind of value. We all know that this has a retail value, right? If I go to the store and it's sitting on the shelf, it's going to have a certain value assigned to it. And you go from store to store to store. For the most part, it's going to be the same, barring any sales that are happening. But it's a fixed value. It doesn't really fluctuate all that much. From time to time, a little bit here and there. But we use an objective standard to determine the value of this pen. And if I were to go to the front and say, hey, I really want this pen, but I don't want to pay the price that it's listed, what would they tell you? That's the value. Can't really change it. Now, on the other end, there's a different kind of value that we assign to things, and I'm going to call that perceived value. And this is more of a subjective standard. Values that fluctuate over time, values that fluctuate depending on the mindset and the biases of the evaluator. So this is a silver pen. I like the way it looks, so it has value to me. Some of you may hate silver pens, so you may not have a high value of this. I like the way it writes. It feels good when I write it. It's a Sharpie S Gel, for those of you who are curious. I worked for a boss one time that exclusively used green pens, and it drove me insane. Because anytime I'm like, oh, I need a pen, he's like, here. I'm like, I don't want to use your green pen. It's just, I had an issue with it. But we are constantly assigning values to different things and objects. Now, this concept gets really, really, really interesting when we start doing this with people. Because people, everyone in here, has a value. And how do you determine someone's value? We talked before about there's these two kinds of values, have actual value and perceived value. How do you determine someone's actual value? I would suggest to you that that's not really something we can do, right? Only God knows our actual value, put it that way. And the reason we can't really do that as a community is because nobody's going to be able to agree upon the metric that we use to determine someone's actual value. Like we talked about this pen. We can all agree that if the retail value says it's $1, it's $1. Can't really do that with people very well. So how do we determine someone's value? Well, we have what I'm going to call perceived value of not only ourselves, but of other people. And it's a value that I get to determine in my own right. It's not something that you can tell me how my perceived value of something or someone should be. And this is incredibly chaotic territory that you get into because everybody has their own standards that they're going to create to determine what those values should be. And oftentimes the standard, and I would say most often, the standard that we're going to use to determine someone else's value, or let me back up. The standard that we use to determine my value, my own value, is often the same standard that I'm going to put on somebody else to determine their value. For example, if I'm somebody that puts a great deal of importance in the way that I look, I spend good money, I like to wear nice things, I like to look nice. There's probably a pretty good chance that when I perceive somebody else's value, I'm going to use a similar blueprint to determine that person's value. I may look down on them because obviously they don't care about the way that they look. And by the way, that can go in reverse as well. There's a lot of people that they don't put a lot of emphasis on the way they look, so they may judge somebody else for the effort that they put into the way they look. If I'm somebody that puts a great deal of importance on family and relationships and togetherness, and I'm really proud of my family and the closeness of those relationships, I might be somebody, if I'm going to apply that standard to somebody else, I may be somebody that would look down on somebody else's family issues. Can you believe how their kids act in church? Can you believe they got a divorce? In other words, the ruler that we use to determine our value is often the same ruler that we use for other people. And it's interesting when we get into Matthew, Jesus is kind of flipping the script on us in that sense, right? We use similar rulers to determine the value. And everybody in here, everybody in the world strives to attain a high perceived value of ourselves. But that's a very wide spectrum. I think we can all agree on that. And what I mean by that is if I have a very low perceived value of myself, right, it's very low, I'm probably someone who's sad. I'm probably unmotivated, maybe depressed. If I'm somebody that has a very high perceived value of myself, and I'm going to say an overly inflated high perceived value of myself, I'm probably arrogant. maybe difficult to work with, unkind. And what's interesting about this self-perceived value is that fluctuates and can change with a snap of a finger. I can remember a time in my life when I graduated from Harding University, graduated, had really good grades, I just assumed the job offers were going to be lining up down the street because of how brilliant I was. I got married. Marty walked in at a really good time, by the way, talking about how brilliant I was. But the job offers weren't there, and I had a very low perceived value of myself. I just got married, I wanted to provide for my family, and I couldn't do it. And I was not in a good place. But then you get that job, and overnight, well, now all of a sudden I have a very high perceived value of myself. Life events can change the way you view your own value. But what is the quickest, and I'm not going to say best, but what is the quickest and most efficient way to elevate my own perceived value? And I would suggest to you that the most efficient way to do that is to devalue somebody else. And that's my explanation as to why we judge people, because we want to elevate our own perceived value. If I can convince myself, again, if I can convince myself that someone else is less, then I just convinced myself that I am more. And we're doing this all the time, and we don't even think about it. But the idea of judging others has been around for a very, very long time. I mean, Jesus is talking about it here. But it's taken on a little bit of a new and unique meaning in the last 20 or so years. And why would it have taken on a new meaning in the last 20 or so years? Social media. We're all familiar with social media. How many judgments take place on a daily basis in your own home because of social media? By just looking at that picture that somebody posted. Can you believe what she's wearing in this picture? Can you believe how much weight he's put on? The problem with perceived value is it's a system that's based on perception that's determined only upon the information that I have at my disposal at any given moment. You think about that picture you see on Facebook, there's four corners to that. It's limited. You don't see the whole panorama of the whole picture behind that picture. And we are really good, human beings are really good at filling in those blanks when certain information is missing. You know, you look at a picture, and I'm giving this example because I've said it before, but you look at a picture and somebody's on a really fun vacation. And you're like, wow, where'd they get all the money for this vacation? Now, the only thing in the picture frame is that they're having a good time on their vacation. That's all there is. But I take that and I like to start filling in the blanks. Well, clearly they got the money because they have a lot of family money. Is that true? Probably not. Did I just fill in that blank because I was missing information? Absolutely. And we create a perceived value based upon the information that we do not have. Now, Facebook, most of you are familiar. It began in the dorm room of Mark Zuckerberg at Harvard University around 2003. But at the time, it wasn't called Facebook. It was actually called Face Mash. If anybody's ever seen The Social Network, it kind of goes into detail on that. But Face Mash was the name of their website. And Mark Zuckerberg and his friends in their Harvard dorm room created this website. And the entire purpose of Face Mash, it was an online service solely for Harvard students for the purpose of judging the attractiveness of fellow students. That was the whole design behind it. This is more or less a screenshot of what it would look like, and cartoons have been inserted to protect the innocent. But this is what the website looked like, and above you had two images of somebody, two different people, and it said, "Were we led in for our looks? No. Will we be judged by them? Yes." And that was the whole kind of creation of social media. I also liked putting this up there. Everyone remember Netscape Navigator? There's a throwback for you. Some of you may remember MySpace. Anybody had a MySpace page? MySpace was born roughly the same time as Facebook, around 2003. It had a very similar look and feel and usefulness to Facebook at the time. But the kind of key quality of MySpace was this concept of your top 8 friends. Everyone remember that? And you had a page, it was your page, and you would go in and rank your top 8 friends. And you can imagine you put a tool like that in the hands of a high school student, and you know certainly that they're going to be mindful of their fellow friends' feelings. Absolutely, right? Absolutely not. Friendships destroyed. So-and-so is my best friend. Wait a minute, why am I number 4 today? So the whole foundation of social media was predicated on the idea of judgments. So let's go back to Matthew for a minute. In Matthew chapter 7, when the word judge here is used, it's the word in the Greek, it's the word krino. And the word means to pick out or choose by separating, or to make a choice either positively or negatively. Well, that's a kind of a broad definition, right? We're making choices every single day. Google told me that we make about 35,000 choices every single day. That's a lot of choices that we make. But this word is typically not referred to choices being made just in general. It's usually being referred as making a determination of somebody's innocence or guilt, making a determination of someone's right or wrong. And it's often a word associated with standing before trial to determine your innocence or guilt. So I think it's important that we recognize exactly what Jesus is talking about here. He's warning us against putting ourselves in a position where we are making a determination of someone else's guilt or innocence. Because ultimately, whose job is that? That's God's job. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5 says, "Therefore judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in the darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God." And even Jesus himself had comments from time to time where he would talk about, it's not my job to judge, that's God's job. John chapter 12, 47, "For I did not come to judge the world, I came to save the world." So he's talking about judgments, but does that mean we're never in a position to make certain types of judgments? Are we forbidden from making judgments? And what do those circumstances look like if we do? Moving on to chapter 3, it says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let's take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So he's defining the kind of judgments that he is condemning. And on one hand, he's saying that he's condemning judging when we are blind to our own faults. We have an incredible ability to forgive our own flaws. We're really good at that. Anybody good in here? We're good at that? But we often have a difficult time forgiving the faults of others. And Jesus is calling for us to be a little bit self-reflective, to be introspective about our own faults before we start determining someone else's. We often get this feeling of self-righteousness. Remember, think of that example we gave at the beginning where we're sitting in that big comfy chair and we had all the intention in the world to be kind and merciful, but this feels kind of nice, doesn't it? Feels powerful. He's also condemning judging without mercy and love, which is a very similar sentiment to what James chapter 2 says. Starting in verse 12, it says, "Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment." You'll notice James chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 7 have very similar sentiments. It's this concept of we have a little bit of input into how we are going to be judged. It's often determined by how we are going to associate with other people in the world. If we make judgments without showing mercy, then no mercy will be shown to us, which is essentially what Jesus said in verse 2 up here. But he's also implying that there are times when we need to make judgments, that we must make judgments, and that is after we have corrected our own faults. We have to remove that plank from our own eye. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that Jesus is using an analogy that involves the eyes. Because the whole concept of this, we have to be able to see. And have you ever thought about how absolutely absurd of an example this is? This is just a basic cartoon about it, but Jesus is giving this an example about somebody having a giant plank in their eye. So I think about some guy with a a giant 2x4 just sticking right out of his face. It's an absurd example, but it's absurd by design. And it's always created a very unique visual. But how can we reasonably assess the faults in someone else when our faults are just as severe or even more severe? And I don't necessarily see Jesus right here using this as a warning against judging. I think it is a warning against judging, but that's not the main sentiment here. I think the main sentiment, it's a statement about our capability to judge. Put another way, we do not have the capacity to judge others clearly if we have a giant plank sticking out of our eye. It's not that we just shouldn't do it, it's that you can't do it. You don't have the capacity to do it. And it's once we remove that plank, we can remove that fault from our own lives, we're able to see, we can discern, we can judge, and we can help others who've been overtaken in their own faults. But also keep in mind kind of the context that Jesus is talking about here. He says, how can you say to your brother? Now, the word brother that's used here in the Greek is adelphos, and so it's talking about somebody within the technical definition is someone within a same religious community. So it's talking about this is the standard we're to apply to each other in here, to your brothers and sisters in Christ. And again, it's a similar sentiment that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you too may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. But then he goes and gives us another kind of unique example. And in verse 6, he says, do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So again, he's not ruling out all forms of judgment. And I think this gives us another example. And you look at the context of this verse right here, and it's kind of a unique example. He's talking about dogs, he's talking about hogs. But it implies that certain judgments have to be made to determine who are those dogs and who are those hogs. Otherwise, how can we know who to give that which is holy to, unless we're making certain determinations? And you look at the broader context of this. Jesus talks about this in other places. John chapter 7 talks about we have to judge with a righteous judgment. 1 Corinthians talks about judging those inside the church. 1 John chapter 4 talks about testing the spirits, which requires a level of judgment. But again, it's our job to determine who is worthy and who is a dog. And that requires a judgment on our part. So we're being told that we have to make judgments between those who are going to be receptive of certain criticisms versus those who will not, the dogs and the pigs. And with those who are receptive, and hopefully that's your brothers and sisters in Christ, we need to be long-suffering in helping them through their error. 2 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 23, says, don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments because you know they produce quarrels. I feel like that was a verse written with social media in mind. Don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments because you know they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed in their hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil who has taken them captive to do his will. So we go back to what we were talking about last week in Matthew chapter 5. Remember we talked about this concept of being luminaries, about being the light, about being the salt of the earth. We can provide gentle instruction, but we, again, are not the ultimate judge. That's God's job. But for those who are not receptive, what is he telling us? He's saying we're not to waste our time with that which is sacred on people who are not going to be receptive. Our time, remember we talked before, everything we do, objects, people, the things we're involved in this world has value. And he's telling us our time and our judgments have value. Our judgments as Christians, our value when we're able to take that speck out of our own eye has value. If I were to walk up to a pig and forgive me, I don't own any pearls, so I can't say pearls, but let's say a nice watch. If I walked up to a pig and handed it a nice watch, what would that pig do with the watch? I'm not a pig guy. I'd probably eat it, right? Trample on it. It says it would trample it underfoot, turn and tear you to pieces. The pig doesn't have the ability to recognize the value that it's just been given. I can tell you one thing the pig wouldn't do. The pig wouldn't put it on its little grimy little hoof and say, wow, that's a nice piece, appreciate that. Because the pig doesn't have the ability to recognize that value. In just the same way, there are people in this world that don't have the ability to recognize the value of what we're offering them, of our judgments. And he's asking us, or he's telling us, not to waste your time. And you can probably think of people in your life that would fit into this category, right? Someone in your life, you would love to approach them and be like, hey, the way you're living just not working. And you can play that out in your head of how that conversation is going to go, and it's going to end in immediate, discomfort, immediate feeling of betrayal on the other side. Now that said, some people will recognize that value, and I would hope the people in this room could recognize the value. For instance, if I'm living a life and you recognize a sin that I'm involved in, I would hope that you feel confident that you could come to me and provide gentle instruction and that I would be receptive. I'll give you another example. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is directing the 12 to go out into the communities and drive out demons and heal the sick. And it says they were given the authority to do so. So they were given special abilities to do this. And starting in verse 12, it says, as you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, that's an interesting word. If the home is deserving. How are they going to be able to tell if the home was deserving? They got to make some form of judgment, right? And the word deserving here literally means worthy. Or in other words, and this is the definition, to assess the weight and assign a value. So if you have to, he's telling them, go out into the world and determine if the home is deserving. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town, shake off the dust off your feet. Truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. So he's telling us that our time and our energies as Christians have value. Now, does that mean that we're supposed to just ignore people? Does that mean that we're just supposed to leave these people drowning in their own faults and wrongs? By no means. Should we not? To a very blind, very preliminary reading of this sounds like a gold mine for us introverts out there. I don't have to interact with anybody. Sounds great. But that's not what he's saying. Rather than judgments and condemnation, we are to be what we talked about last week, the salt of the earth. Go out there, flavor the world. Go out there, be a light for the dark world. Do good deeds and glorify the Father in heaven so that others may see those good deeds and glorify the Father themselves. And that's more or less where Jesus is going with this. But it's at this point in his sermon, again, this is still part of the Sermon on the Mount, that he shifts gears a little bit. And in verse 7, he takes a little bit of a turn in his messaging and talks about focusing on making requests and petitions to God. Starting in verse 7, he says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? If you had to sum up this passage of Scripture in one word, how would you sum it up? Anybody? I'll throw a word out there for you. Perseverance. He's giving us three basic instructions here. We're being told to ask, we're being told to seek, and we're being told to knock. Now, what's interesting about the translation from Greek into English is in the English, it seems very in the present. It seems very linear. But in the Greek, what he's actually saying, or what the Scripture is actually saying, is keep on asking, and it will be given to you. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. The context implies that this is not a one-and-done exchange. And I feel like we've all been in a part of our lives where we've done the asking, we've done the seeking, and we've done the knocking, and we're like, where's the results? There was a point in my life, I mentioned before, I came out of Harding and couldn't find a job. Well, I actually ended up finding a job, and it's a job I hated. And it was selling secondary insurance for Aflac. I have a collection of ducks to prove it. But that was a hard job. Cold calling, walking into businesses, walking up to people, and just dropping the line, and the success rate was minimal. Now, for some people, they could be successful with it, but they had to keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. It requires a level of perseverance. But it's interesting, this concept here, because the progression of these terms themselves is the very basic blueprint for finding just about anything in this life. It's kind of a simple blueprint for inquiry in our life. And I'm going to use the example of finding the remote control in the house, because my kids will often misplace it, sometimes intentionally. How the remote control ends up in the bathroom, I don't even know how that works, but my kids find a way to do it. But if I'm looking for the remote control because I want to sit down and watch TV, what's the first thing I'm going to do? Hey, where's the remote control? Right? I'm going to ask. And most likely it was Sadie, because that's what she does, my 5-year-old. And she'll say, well, it's in your chair in between the cushions. So what's the next thing I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the chair. I'm going to seek. I'm going to go look for it, right? And then once I get to the chair, am I just going to look at it? What am I going to do? I'm going to reach my hand down there. I'm going to knock. I'm going to go find it. So it's a basic progression of finding anything in this world. But he's asking us to do that with him. And particularly, this concept is relevant as it comes to prayer. I mentioned before that we're all incredibly impatient people. You ever find yourself and the internet goes out for like half a second and it's like, what just happened? It's like, I need immediate results. When we're driving in our car, we listen to music in our family. We're music people. We listen to music entirely too loud. But we listen to music through like a streaming service, I think Amazon Music. And there are certain dead spots around the Woodlands where the music is just going to stop. It's that bridge right over there by the Sonic on Research, always, every time. And if the music stops playing, my kids just freak out. Oh, why'd you change the song? What's going on? We are very impatient people. And we do that with our prayer life as well. You ever been in a situation where you close your eyes and you pray and you ask God for very specific things, very detailed things, and then you're disappointed when you open your eyes and the world looks the exact same as it did before you closed them? We're very impatient. And Jesus talks a lot about this throughout his ministry. If you recall in Luke chapter 11, the parable of the persistent friend. In Luke 18, the parable of the persistent widow. And we also do this when it comes to studying our Bibles. How many of us give up on studying the Bible because we maybe fall a little behind in our daily Bible reading? We have that schedule. We're optimistic. Oh, now we're a couple days behind. Oh, all's lost. We'll start again on January 1st. But those who persevere in their studies are the ones who are going to benefit from the blessings that God is providing. But it's also helpful because in verse 9, Jesus is providing us a motivation for that perseverance. And he says that God delights in giving good things to his children. And to illustrate that, he makes a comparison between our earthly fathers and God being our heavenly Father. Which is, we call God our Father all the time, right? This is one of those examples. Jesus is making a direct reference to God being like a father. And when my kids come and ask me for something, and I have different answers, because if my boys come and ask me for something, I'm probably going to say no. But if my little princess angel comes and asks me for something, she's probably going to get it. And the sad thing is she knows it, so I got to be careful about that. But we go to great lengths to give good things to our kids. But is that theory unlimited? If my kids come and ask me for something, I apply a reasonability standard to that, right? If that's something within my power, if it's something that's not going to cost me a fortune, I'm probably going to try to get it for them. I was actually having a conversation the other day with my son. He's just about to turn 12, and he's really obsessed right now with Rivians. I don't know where he got this, but the car. And he said, "Hey, Dad, when I turn 16, you're going to buy me a Rivian, right?" I said, "Good luck with that, son." And in fact, what I told him, we were in my truck that I bought like when he was born. This is as good as it's going to get right here. Set your expectations accordingly. But we apply a standard of reasonability to that, and God does the same thing as well. But the issue that we run into with this concept is that when we start confusing what a gift is and what entitlement is. What's the difference in a gift and an entitlement? Gifts are given out of love, entitlements are given out of obligation. And we often interpret something like this to mean that we are entitled to good things. We're entitled to these gifts in exchange for our Christianity. I'm asking, I'm seeking, I'm knocking. Where's the results? And a lot of religious messaging in the world today is focused on this type of quid pro quo type of Christianity. And it feels good, sounds good. It's motivation to get us going, motivation to live good, faithful lives. But then what happens when things don't go our way? We lose faith. It's almost like, God, I upheld my end of the bargain. Where are you at? You ever find yourself doing that? But in verse 10, he says, if a son asks his father for a fish, will he give him a snake? Now, some of you people may actually give snakes to your kids, and I can't speak to that. But I don't think he's talking about real snakes in this analogy. Because in most cases, we're going to say, of course not. My son asked me for a fish. Why would I give him a snake? But let's flip that concept on its head for just a minute. What if your child came to you and asked you for a snake? Are you just going to give him a snake? And again, we're not talking about real snakes here. Hypothetically. We're talking about things that we know are not good for them. If my son asks me for something that I know is not good for him, am I going to give it to him? Of course not. Have you ever considered that sometimes we may not be smart enough to recognize that when we're asking God, or we think we're asking God for a fish, we're actually asking God for a snake? And maybe that's not why we're getting the results that we're looking for or expecting. I think the message here overall is that God is not necessarily promising good things for us, but it's saying that he delights in giving good things to us. And we have to use that accordingly. So then we go on to Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. And everybody in here knows this as the golden rule. So it says, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. And we call this the golden rule. And we call it the golden rule because we often find ourselves in this world feeling in a position where we have to make a decision. We have to make a determination about how we're going to behave, how we're going to respond to something, wondering what the right way to act is, unable to recall that specific verse that gets really into details about something like this. So we always can fall back on verses like this. And we often look at the Bible as a set of rules, a rule book or a guidebook. Some people call it life's instruction manual. And I'll be honest, I always kind of tense up when I hear that. I don't think the Bible is a rule book or an instruction manual. Rather, it's a collection of principles. And this is one of those foundational principles that you can carry with you everywhere you go. So let's talk about this for a minute, because the golden rule is not an exclusive, in theory, concept to the Bible alone. In fact, most religions in the world have a very similar sentiment. So we're going to finish the golden rule in 5 minutes. We can do this. And I know that's really small, and I apologize for that, but we have a few different things to go through. So in the Hindu religion, in the Mahabharata, it says, this is the sum of duty. Do not unto others that which would cause you pain if done to you. In Buddhism, in the Udana Varga, it says, hurt not others with that which pains yourself. The Talmud says, what is hateful to you, do not to your fellow man. That is the entire law. All the rest is commentary. Islam, in the Quran, says, none of you will believe until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. The Baha'i faith teaches he should not wish for others that which he does not wish for himself, nor promise that which he doth not fulfill. That was a mouthful. Zoroastrianism says, do not do to others what is harmful for yourself. And I know it's probably difficult to see, but I notated where it could be found and more or less the era in which it would have been written. And you'll notice most of these were written, Hindu, 15th century, Udana 6th century, well after Jesus walked the earth. There's a couple other sources as well. It's not exclusively to religion, but also to certain philosophers. Philosopher by the name of Pittacus, who was around in 650 BC. Do not that to your neighbor, that you would not suffer from him. Confucius, in around the 5th century, said, do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you. Isocrates, do not unto others what angers you if done to you by others. A guy by the name of Seneca, treat your inferiors as you would be treated by your betters. And you're probably thinking, why in the world are we going through all these? Well, I will pose a question to you. What is the difference between the majority of these and what Jesus is teaching us in Matthew chapter 7? Because Jesus' rule is a little bit different than all these. Jesus is asking us and he's requiring of us to do something favorable to others. Most of these are in the negative. Do not do something so that somebody else doesn't do that to you. Jesus is teaching us to do something in the way that we would want others to do to us. In fact, Jesus says, do unto others what you would have them do to you. These others, in summary, don't do to others what you don't want done to you. Now, is that just a different way of saying the same thing? Or is it a completely different concept? And I would throw out there that I feel like that's a very different concept. Some of these other rules make living life as a hermit a lot more justifiable. I can go live in a cave and not do things to others, right? That's really simple. It's easy. But Jesus is asking us to do something. Do unto others. With Jesus, what is required is that you show kindness to others. And also implies that we have to be doers of the word. See James chapter 1. We have to be doers of the word. And really the only one on this list that comes close is Islam. But for you historians out there, Muhammad came about, I think, 600 years or so after Jesus. How much did Jesus influence Muhammad's teaching? Quite a lot of it, actually. Obviously, there's vast differences as well. And then I mentioned another guy by the name of Seneca. He was a philosopher who was actually living at the time Jesus was going around preaching these things. How much of his philosophy was influenced by what Jesus had to say? But it's a guideline for righteous conduct towards other, one in harmony, as he says, with the law and the prophets. And again, from last week's passage in Matthew chapter 5, he said he did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. And so this is a standard, a righteous standard that contrasts to what the Pharisees and the scribes were doing and teaching at that time. And this is the one rule that summarizes the law and the prophets and what they were all about. So next week we're going to get into, and I'm not going to give you homework, but next week's class is based out of Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. And I'll let you try to figure out what our passages or what our lesson's going to be about. But anyways, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week.